I want you to picture something. You're 66 years old, standing on your own front porch, holding a birthday present you spent 3 weeks choosing for your 7-year-old granddaughter. And a car pulls into your driveway that isn't the car you were expecting. It's your former son-in-law, alone, no children in the back seat. And he tells you, standing there in your own front yard, that he and his new wife have decided it would be healthier for the kids if visits with you became considerably less frequent going forward. And you stand there holding a present that will never be opened by the child it was meant for. And you understand, in that exact moment, that you have just lost your grandchildren the same way you lost their mother. Except this time, nobody died. Someone simply decided you no longer belonged in their lives. My name is Rosa Delgado. I'm 68 years old now, and 2 years ago I lost my only daughter, Elena, to a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Fresno, California. She was 39 years old, married with 2 children, my grandchildren, Sofia and Mateo, who were 7 and 5 at the time. What I want to tell you about today is not simply the grief of losing my daughter, though that grief has never once left me and likely never will. I want to tell you about what happened afterward, when my son-in-law remarried within a year and slowly, deliberately, cut me almost entirely out of my own grandchildren's lives, and how that second loss, in some ways, very nearly broke me more completely than the first one had. And I want to tell you how I ended up rebuilding an entire life for myself in a city called Cebu in the Philippines, a place I had never once considered before grief and betrayal, together, left me with almost nothing familiar left to hold on to. I need to back up, though, because I don't think any of this makes sense without understanding exactly what Elena meant to me, and exactly how central those 2 children had become to whatever future I imagined for myself. I was born in a small town outside Guadalajara, Mexico, and immigrated to California with my parents when I was 11 years old. I met my husband Manuel at 19, and we built a modest life together in the Central Valley, he working construction, me eventually running a small tailoring business out of our home. Once Elena, our only child, was old enough for me to manage both. Manuel passed away from a workplace accident when Elena was just 14, and I raised her alone from that point forward, the 2 of us growing into something considerably closer than mother and daughter typically become. Partners in a real sense, navigating a difficult decade together after Manuel's death. Elena married a man named Todd when she was 29, an accountant, steady and for the better part of a decade, genuinely kind to both Elena and to me. They had Sofia first, then Mateo 2 years later. And I want to be honest that those 2 children became, over the following years, something close to the entire center of my remaining life. Manuel gone, no other children of my own, Elena my only family in any meaningful sense. Those grandchildren represented to me the continuation of everything Manuel and I had once built together, a future I could actually see and touch rather than simply imagine. I babysat regularly at least twice a week throughout their early childhoods. I taught Sofia to sew on my old machine, the same one I'd used to build my tailoring business decades earlier. I taught Mateo, once he was old enough, simple Spanish phrases that Elena herself had grown up speaking with me, but had, in the busy rhythm of her own adult life, not always found time to pass down as thoroughly as she might have liked. Those children called me Abuela Rosa, and I want to be honest that hearing those two words across those years gave my life a shape and a purpose I don't believe anything else could have replaced after losing Manuel. Elena died on a Tuesday evening in March, driving home from a work event in weather that had turned suddenly dangerous. Hydroplaning on a stretch of highway that, I would later learn, had claimed several other lives over the preceding years, without the state ever installing the drainage improvements that might have prevented it. I received the call from Todd himself, his voice barely functioning, and I remember very little of the following days, except a specific, total numbness that I understand now was simply my mind's way of protecting me from processing something too large to fully absorb all at once. The funeral itself is mostly a blur to me now, except for one image that has never once faded. Sofia, 7 years old, standing beside me in a small black dress, holding my hand so tightly it left marks, asking me, quietly, whether her mommy was going to come back eventually, the way people sometimes do in movies. I did not have a good answer for her, and I don't believe any answer exists that would have been good enough for a 7-year-old asking that particular question. I remember, too, standing at the graveside afterward, Mateo, only 5 at the time, too young to fully grasp what was happening, growing restless in the way small children do at events they cannot yet emotionally process, tugging at my sleeve to ask when we could go get ice cream, a question that struck several of the adults around us as almost unbearably poignant given the circumstances, though I understood, even in my own shattered state, that his confusion was simply the honest response of a 5-year-old confronting something no 5-year-old should have to confront at all. I held his hand through the remainder of the service, grateful in some strange way for the small, ordinary distraction of a child who did not yet understand the permanence of what had happened, since it gave me, if only briefly, something simple and concrete to focus on instead of the enormity of everything else. The first year after Elena's death, Todd and I grew, if anything, considerably closer, bound together by shared grief and by our mutual, fierce love for those 2 children. I babysat even more frequently than before, since Todd was suddenly navigating single fatherhood while also managing his own overwhelming grief. And those children, in turn, seemed to find in me one of the few remaining constants in a world that had otherwise become entirely unpredictable to them. I remember thinking during that first difficult year that whatever else had been taken from me, at least this particular bond between myself and my grandchildren remained fully intact, perhaps even strengthened by everything we'd all survived together. Todd began dating again about 14 months after Elena's death, a development I understood intellectually, even as some part of me struggled with the emotional reality of it. He met a woman named Brianna, considerably younger than Elena had been, and within 8 months of their first date, they were married. A timeline that struck me, even at the time, as faster than I might have chosen myself, though I recognized that grief moves differently for everyone, and that Todd, raising 2 young children largely alone, likely felt pressures toward stability that I, as their grandmother, rather than their sole remaining parent, did not fully share. I want to be honest that the changes, once Brianna entered the household fully, were gradual at first, small enough that I told myself for several months that I was perhaps overreacting to what were simply the natural adjustments of a newly blended family finding its footing. Visits that had once been twice weekly became once weekly, then every other week. Phone calls with the children, which Todd had always encouraged warmly in that first year, began requiring more advanced scheduling, more of what felt, increasingly, like careful gatekeeping rather than simple, busy family logistics. I remember one particular Sunday, about 10 months into Todd and Brianna's marriage, when I arrived for what I understood to be our regular weekly visit, only to find Brianna informing me at the door, politely but firmly, that the children were already in the middle of a family activity, and that perhaps I should have called ahead to confirm, despite this being the exact same standing arrangement Todd and I had maintained without any need for confirmation since the children's infancy. I stood on that same porch, holding a bag of the children's favorite pan dulce I'd brought, as I always did, feeling a specific quiet humiliation at being treated in what still felt like my own extended family's home as an inconvenience requiring advance clearance. I mentioned this particular incident to Todd privately the following week, hoping to address it directly before it calcified into a permanent new pattern. He was apologetic, genuinely so, I believed at the time, and promised things would return to normal. They did, for a few weeks, before slipping again, a cycle that repeated itself several times over the following months, each apology sincere in the moment, but each subsequent slippage slightly more entrenched than the last, until the pattern itself became, in effect, the new normal neither of us ever fully acknowledged out loud. The specific conversation that changed everything, the one I described at the very beginning of this story, happened almost exactly 2 years after Elena's death, on Sofia's 7th birthday, which had, by unfortunate coincidence, become also nearly the 2-year mark since her mother's passing. I had spent 3 weeks choosing the perfect gift, a beautiful sewing kit meant for a child just beginning to learn the craft, exactly the way I'd once taught her mother, hoping to continue a tradition that connected 3 generations of women in our family. Todd arrived alone, without either child, and explained in careful, rehearsed language that I suspected, even in the moment, had been shaped considerably by Brianna's input, that they had decided as a family that maintaining such close ties to Elena's side of the family might be making it harder for the children to fully move forward and bond with their new family structure. I asked him, standing there in my own driveway, holding that unopened gift, whether this meant I would simply be seeing my grandchildren less often, or whether something more permanent was actually being proposed. His answer, delivered with what I recognized, even through my own devastation, as genuine discomfort at having to deliver it, was that Brianna felt strongly that monthly visits, at most, would be healthier going forward, and that spontaneous calls or unscheduled visits, the kind that had characterized our entire relationship since the children's infancy, would need to stop entirely. I want to describe what the following year actually felt like, because I think the particular texture of this kind of loss, the deliberate, gradual severing of a living relationship, rather than the sudden, absolute finality of death, deserves to be understood honestly rather than glossed over. Elena's death had been devastating, but it had at least been unambiguous, a grief the entire world around me recognized and for a time honored appropriately. This was different. This was watching two children who called me abuela, who I had helped raise through the hardest year of their young lives, gradually recede from monthly visits to once every 2 months. Then, within that same difficult year, effectively stopping altogether after a series of increasingly thin excuses about scheduling conflicts and the children's own busy new lives with Brianna's extended family. I consulted an attorney during that period, exploring whether grandparent visitation rights, which do exist in some form in California law, might offer any actual recourse. What I learned, painfully, was that the legal standard required demonstrating that continued contact was in the children's best interest against a fit parent's wishes, an extraordinarily difficult bar to meet when the parent in question, Todd, was not neglecting or endangering the children in any legally recognizable way, simply choosing, along with his new wife, to restructure the family's social ties in a direction that happened to exclude me almost entirely. My attorney was honest with me that pursuing a formal legal battle would likely be expensive, protracted, and, given the specific legal standard, quite possibly unsuccessful, and would almost certainly poison whatever small remaining goodwill existed between myself and Todd, beyond any hope of future repair. I chose, in the end, not to pursue legal action, a decision I have questioned many times since, but that I still believe, on balance, was the right one, given the actual likely outcomes. What I could not choose, however, was to simply stop grieving the specific, ongoing loss of two children who were, in every meaningful sense beyond biology, among the most important people remaining in my entire life. I want to describe one particular evening from that period, because I think it captures something the general devastation doesn't fully explain. About 16 months after Elena's death, roughly 4 months after that driveway conversation, I sat alone in my house on what would have been Elena's 40th birthday. A day I had, in previous years, always spent with Elena and the children together, a small family tradition of baking her favorite cake, regardless of how old she turned. I baked that cake alone that year, an act that felt, in the moment, both absurd and somehow necessary. And I sat at my kitchen table, eating a slice by myself, surrounded by photographs of a daughter I had lost and 2 grandchildren who, I now understood, I might genuinely never see grow up in any meaningful way again. I did not make any decisions that particular evening beyond the decision to simply survive it. But something in me had begun over the following months, a slow, painful process of reassessing what remained of my life in California, a state that now felt, increasingly, less like home and more like a landscape entirely populated by reminders of everything and everyone I had lost. My closest remaining friend, a woman named Graciela I had known since our own children were small together, gently suggested, about 6 months after that birthday, that perhaps I needed to consider building something entirely new for myself, somewhere that didn't require driving past Elena's old house or the school Sofia and Mateo used to attend every single week. It was Graciela, in fact, who first mentioned the Philippines to me, having heard from a cousin of hers who'd retired to Cebu several years earlier and described, in considerable detail, a genuinely welcoming community and a cost of living that would allow my modest remaining savings, built primarily from decades of running my tailoring business, to stretch considerably further than they ever could in California. I remember my initial reaction being one of genuine surprise, a place I had never once considered, geographically and culturally, about as far from everything familiar to me as I could possibly imagine going. But the idea, once planted, did not fully leave me, the way ideas sometimes take root specifically in the moments when you are most desperate for any path forward that doesn't involve continuing to live inside a landscape of pure loss. I began researching quietly over the following months the retirement visa available to foreigners over 50, the actual cost of living, expat communities in various cities across the country. Cebu kept surfacing in my research as a particularly popular, well-established landing spot, described repeatedly as offering both genuine natural beauty and a level of modern infrastructure and healthcare access that some of the more remote provinces couldn't always match. After nearly 4 months of quiet research, I decided on something small and containable, a single trip, 2 weeks, to see the place with my own eyes before committing to anything more permanent. I flew out of Fresno alone, 67 years old, carrying a grief that had, by that point, layered itself into something considerably more complicated than simple mourning, toward a country I knew almost nothing about beyond what I had read in the preceding months. I landed in Manila first, spent one disoriented night adjusting to the heat and noise that seems to greet every visitor to that airport. and then took a short flight south to Cebu, where a woman named Perla connected to me through the same online expat forums, where I'd spent months quietly asking questions, had offered to meet me and show me around for a few days. Perla met me at the airport, holding a hand-lettered sign with my name spelled correctly. And the city itself surprised me from the very first drive out of that airport, considerably more developed and lively than I had somehow expected. A genuine mix of modern shopping districts and older, more residential neighborhoods that felt, even on that first drive, less overwhelming than I had braced myself for. Perla put me up in a modest guest house for those first several days, and on my second evening there, took me to a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. And I remember sitting there with a plate of grilled seafood in front of me, listening to Perla explain, with a warmth I hadn't expected from someone I'd known barely 24 hours, that she too had lost a child years earlier, a son to illness when he was still young, and that she understood, in a way few people back in Fresno seemed to, the particular loneliness of grief that the people around you eventually grow tired of accommodating. The grief itself people will sit with you through for a while, she told me, but the specific ongoing loss underneath it, the loss of a whole imagined future you were supposed to have, that one, people expect you to simply finish grieving on some schedule that suits them. It never worked that way for me either. Perla also introduced me, during that same visit, to a modest private hospital not far from where she lived, mostly out of the same practical instinct that had led me to research every possible detail before committing to anything as significant as an international move. The administrator who walked me through the general costs did so with a patience I hadn't experienced from any provider back home in years. And the actual figures, when I finally understood them, struck me as almost impossible to believe, given what equivalent care would cost, even with the Medicare coverage I anticipated eventually needing. By the end of that 2-week trip, I knew, in the particular quiet way you know something before you fully admitted it to yourself in words, that I needed to rebuild whatever remained of my life somewhere entirely new. I flew home to Fresno and spent nearly 3 months finalizing the practical details, the visa paperwork, the sale of my house, a process made considerably more painful by having to sort through decades of belongings that included, inevitably, boxes of Elena's own childhood keepsakes and photographs of Sofia and Mateo from years when I had still been a regular, welcomed presence in their lives. I flew out on a one-way ticket roughly 5 months after that trip, 67 years old, toward a life I could not have fully imagined for myself even a single year earlier, carrying with me a grief for my daughter that I understood by then would never fully resolve, alongside a second, ongoing grief for 2 living children who I still, to this day, love as completely as I loved them the day they were born, even as our actual contact has narrowed to little more than occasional, carefully monitored video calls that Todd still, to his credit, has never fully eliminated, however infrequent they've become. The small apartment I arranged, modest but comfortable, sat in a quiet residential area of Cebu City called Banilad, not far from where Perla herself lived, and she met me at the airport again with a small bouquet of flowers, helping me settle in over those first difficult days of building an entirely unfamiliar daily existence at 67 years old. I want to be honest that the first several months were considerably harder than my brief visit had prepared me for. The particular disorientation of grieving, simultaneously both a dead daughter and 2 living grandchildren I had effectively lost through someone else's deliberate choice, in a place where I knew almost no one and understood almost nothing about the daily rhythms of ordinary life. There were mornings I woke in that unfamiliar apartment and simply lay there, uncertain whether building something new here represented genuine healing or simply a more comfortable form of running away from problems that would, I feared, eventually find me regardless of the distance I'd put between us. What began to change things gradually was Perla's introduction, about 2 months in, to a small group of women who gathered most Saturday mornings at a modest cafe near the market. Several of them, I discovered with a particular shock of recognition, having navigated their own significant losses, children, spouses, in some cases entire families, scattered by circumstances beyond their control. A woman named Consuelo, in particular, had lost her own daughter to illness years earlier and had, in the aftermath, found herself similarly cut off from her grandchildren by a son-in-law who remarried and gradually restricted contact. A parallel so precise it initially left me almost unable to speak the first time she described it to our small group. Consuelo, over the following months, became one of the closest friendships I have built in my entire adult life. Closer in some ways than friendships I had maintained for decades back in Fresno, precisely because she understood, without my needing to explain a single detail, the exact particular texture of grieving someone still alive, still growing, still somewhere out there in the world, just permanently out of reach. We are the grandmothers who are not allowed to be grandmothers anymore, she told me once, only half joking, though I understood the joke carried a very real weight underneath it. But we can still choose what kind of women we become in spite of that. It was through that same Saturday group that I discovered an opportunity that ended up giving my entire new life its shape and purpose. Consuelo mentioned one morning that a local community center was struggling to find volunteers willing to teach basic sewing and tailoring skills to teenage girls from families with limited resources. Many of them being raised, I learned, by grandmothers themselves, whose own daughters had left for overseas work, or in some sadder cases, had passed away, or become otherwise unable to raise their own children directly. I said yes almost before Consuelo had finished describing the opportunity, recognizing immediately the strange, painful symmetry of teaching exactly the craft I had once taught Sofia, to a room full of girls being raised, much like Sofia and Mateo currently were, by someone other than their own biological parents. There was one girl in particular, a serious, quiet 13-year-old named Angelica, being raised entirely by her own grandmother, while her mother worked as a nurse in Saudi Arabia, sending money home, but unable to be physically present for most of her daughter's actual childhood. Angelica approached the sewing lessons with a focused intensity that reminded me, powerfully and painfully at once, of Sophia at roughly that same age. The same careful, patient concentration I remembered from teaching her on my old machine years earlier, before everything that came afterward. About 7 months into the program, Angelica stayed after one session, wanting help with a project she was hoping to enter into a school competition. And we sat together for nearly 2 hours, working through increasingly complex techniques, until she finally produced a small, beautifully constructed garment that left her practically glowing with pride. Her grandmother, a woman named Nanay Feliza, who had raised 4 grandchildren essentially alone while all their parents worked overseas, came to find me afterward, thanking me at considerable length, and said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "You are giving her something her own mother cannot be here to give her. That is not a small thing, Rosa. Please do not think it is a small thing." About a year into my time in Cebu, I had a health scare that tested, in a very concrete way, whether the fragile new community I'd built here could actually hold up under real pressure. I fainted one afternoon at the sewing program itself, a combination, the hospital later determined, of severe dehydration and blood pressure that had gone unmonitored for longer than it should have. Consuelo, who had been sitting beside me at the time, caught me before I fully hit the floor, and Angelica, 13 years old, ran the 4 blocks to the nearest pharmacy herself, rather than waiting for anyone else to react, returning with electrolyte solution and a pharmacist in tow before an ambulance had even arrived. I spent 2 days in the hospital being monitored, and I want to describe honestly what struck me most during that stay, which was not the medical care itself, though it was thorough and considerably more affordable than anything comparable back in Fresno, but the sheer volume of visitors. Perla came twice daily. Consuelo brought food from her own kitchen rather than trust the hospital cafeteria. Nanay Feliza arrived with Angelica in tow on the 2nd afternoon, the girl uncharacteristically quiet, sitting at the foot of my bed and asking in a small voice whether I would still be well enough to help her prepare for the upcoming competition. I told her yes, and watched something in her young face visibly relax. And I thought, lying in that hospital bed, about how strange and moving it was that a 13-year-old girl, who was not my granddaughter by blood, had run 4 blocks in the heat to help me, while my own actual grandchildren, thousands of miles away, remained largely unaware I had even been unwell at all. About a year into my time in Cebu, I received a video call from Sofia, now 9 years old, arranged, I later learned, somewhat against Brianna's initial preference, but permitted by Todd, who had never fully severed contact, even as he'd allowed it to narrow considerably under his new wife's influence. Sofia, appearing on my screen for the first time in nearly 8 months, looked older, taller, in ways that struck me with a particular aching force. All the ordinary changes of childhood I had missed, accumulating silently, while I'd been rebuilding an entirely different life on the other side of the world. She told me with the specific enthusiasm of a 9-year-old about a sewing project she'd been assigned at school, and asked, tentatively, whether I remembered teaching her on my old machine when she was small. I told her I remembered every single detail of it and watched her face light up in a way that broke something open in my chest that I realized, kept carefully sealed since that driveway conversation over 2 years earlier. Dad says maybe I can visit you someday, Abuela, in the Philippines. Is that a real place people can visit? I told her it was an entirely real place, and that I would treasure the day she actually managed to see it with her own eyes, however far off that day currently seemed. I want to be honest that my relationship with Sofia and Mateo remains, as of this recording, considerably more limited than I would ever have chosen for myself. Occasional video calls, infrequent messages, nothing resembling the daily woven-in closeness we once shared during those first difficult years after Elena's death. Todd, to his credit, has never fully eliminated contact, and I choose to hold on to that fact as something worth genuine gratitude, rather than dwelling exclusively on everything Brianna's influence has otherwise restricted. I do not know, honestly, whether that relationship will ever recover the fullness it once had, and I have made a difficult peace over these past 2 years with the real possibility that it may not. What I have found instead, in a room full of teenage girls, being raised by grandmothers not so different from myself, is a version of the exact same love I once poured so completely into Sofia and Mateo, redirected now toward Angelica and a dozen other girls whose own circumstances, while different in their specifics, rhyme painfully and beautifully with my own. I do not believe this fully replaces what I lost. I don't think anything ever could. But it has given me somewhere real to put a love that still exists, fully intact inside me, with nowhere else it was being allowed to go. I am 68 years old now, having lost my only daughter, and in a slower, more deliberate way, effective daily contact with my only 2 grandchildren, in a country I had never once considered before grief and quiet, ongoing exclusion left me searching for somewhere entirely new to rebuild. My monthly expenses here in Banilad, rent, food, the modest supplies for the sewing program, come to somewhere around 40,000 pesos, just over $700, comfortably covered by what remains of my savings and the modest Social Security I've become eligible for, with room left over that never once existed during those final difficult months in Fresno, watching a house full of memories grow more expensive to simply maintain than I could reasonably justify continuing alone. I think often about that driveway, about the unopened birthday present, about the particular, specific cruelty of losing children who are still alive, still growing, simply somewhere I am no longer fully welcome to witness it happening. I do not believe that particular grief will ever fully resolve, and I have stopped expecting it to. But I have learned, at an age when most people assume the shape of their remaining family is already permanently settled, that love, when it is denied its intended destination, does not simply disappear. It can be redirected, carefully and deliberately, toward people who are genuinely ready to receive it, the way Angelica and a room full of other girls, raised by grandmothers not unlike myself, have shown me these past 2 years. If there is one thing I would want another grandmother watching this, standing somewhere at her own version of that driveway, holding an unopened gift, to understand, it is this: you are allowed to grieve a love that still has nowhere to go, and you are also allowed, at the very same time, to go looking for somewhere new to plant it. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like mine, and I believe you will find them worth your time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next.